What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it has finally begun. The leaks have started to come out for the new Tyranid Codex. And by this, I don't mean official reveals. I do mean actual leaks that's coming from third parties. Now, obviously, we did have a spoiler article today discussing some of the new Vanguard Onslaught detachment rules, as well as the new datasheet for the Neurolictor, which is fine, I guess. It has some additional abilities over a normal Lictor, but it trades off a point of damage on its melee attacks for that, as well as, I believe, a point of toughness, assuming that Lictors remain the same stat line as they are in the current index, which it certainly sounds like they are. That seems like a pretty fair trade-off, and we're probably going to see a unit that is mostly the same cost as a normal Lictor, but obviously does less damage in exchange for having some more psychic auras. Just want to add a couple extra notes after the fact here. The Neurolictor looks like it's an extra wound over a Lictor, which is solid. It's also hilariously not a Psyker, and none of its abilities are psychic, which is kind of weird, to be honest. And, well, I'm excited to see its effectiveness on the tabletop. I'm a little bit worried that its neuro disruption ability, which definitely seems like is meant to be the big draw of this unit. You can hopefully force a battle shock check on somebody, then give yourself a bunch of bonuses and give them a bunch of debuffs. Ultimately, though, it doesn't seem that useful. Your opponent could just stay outside 12 inches of it on their turn, then it triggers at the start of your own turn. So if they are not in 12 inches, there's no way that the Neurolictor could push itself forward to then get itself in range to trigger that ability. On top of that, it being an out-of-phase battle shock means that it disappears at the start of the opponent's next turn, which means that they won't get the -1 to hit unless they battle shock themselves naturally or from Shadow in the War. So that section of the Neurolictor's Saboteur ability only really works in your own fight phase, effectively. Overall, though, if it is somewhere around the same points value of a Lictor, probably be a little bit more expensive, I think it will be an interesting include in a Vanguard Onslaught detachment. On top of that, it is also a Vanguard Invader on its datasheet, so it's likely that we're going to see that keyword get added to datasheets themselves. In addition, we also got a new stratagem that allows infantry units to return to deep strike at the end of the opponent's fight phase. But the article was a little bit weird in that it tried to make the argument that it synergized well with the pheromone trail for free. That allows you to rapid ingress for free with Lictors, even though there's not really a synergy there. If you go into reserve in your opponent's fight phase, you would then come back in your next reinforcement step, which means that you wouldn't need to rapid ingress unless you held them for an entire battle round, and then the use case of the stratagem isn't that effective. Weird article. It also described that Death Leaper got +1 armor saves. It goes to a 3+, I guess, to give her a little bit more survivability with the larger model that gets easier line of sight. Overall, not a lot of actual information about Vanguard Onslaught being revealed today, but what we did get from another source, this is actually another YouTube channel who will, to protect the innocent, remain nameless, who recorded a battle report using the new 10th edition codex. This was probably recorded as a preview, but was accidentally released before the embargo. So definitely an unintentional breach of their NDA, but certainly a mistake. That said, we got some interesting information from the new Unending Swarm detachment rule. This is the Horde focus detachment that we got previewed earlier in the week, but we don't know any of the mechanics so far until now. Now, obviously, all of this comes with a grain of salt. I didn't get to watch the video personally before it was taken down, so I don't know exactly what the contents are, so I'm just transcribing what was picked up by players who did watch the video. But what we got were the detachment rule, an enhancement, as well as several of the stratagems from the detachment to take a look at. Now, the Unending Swarm detachment rule is called Insurmountable Odds. It allows your endless multitude units to move D6 inches after taking damage. Now, allegedly, this is identical wording to the Khorne Berserker and similar to the Carnifex abilities that allows those units to move directly towards the closest enemy unit after receiving damage from a ranged attack. Now, importantly, these abilities are restrictive, but incredibly useful. They allow you to enter engagement range with enemy units, meaning that if you're already up close and personal, even falling back from the Tyranid units does not necessarily protect you from them, because if you shoot them and kill anyone, then they're just going to move back into melee with you, potentially. You also have the ability to stack them with other reactive move effects, things like the Termagant's Skulking Horrors ability that allows them to move when enemies get close to them, and then also could potentially allow allow them to move again when they are shot at, allows the unit to maneuver around the table a lot more quickly than your opponent could be expecting. This is unfortunately specifically for Endless Multitude units, so it doesn't affect the monsters or characters or more specialized infantry, only the big hordes, but obviously that is the focus of the detachment. Now, speaking of Endless Multitude units, they also get a benefit from the Naturalized Camouflage enhancement. This enhancement allegedly allows you to pick 3 Endless Multitude units. I'm not sure what the timing is. It might be in your opponent's shooting phase, or it might be in a command phase, potentially, maybe start of battle round. Within 9 inches of the character with the enhancement, those units gain cover. Pretty useful, honestly, but this also seems like a detachment that's going to be rocking a ton of Venom tropes, and so I have a sneaking suspicion that you're already going to be getting cover for the majority of these models most of the time. It doesn't seem like the most useful upgrade that we could see, especially since it's restricted to Endless Multitude units, and it is extremely expensive. So, depending on what is allowed within the detachment and how the rest of the detachment shakes out, I could see this one getting cut if the other enhancements are strong. Now for the stratagems, and these are incredibly spicy. The first one is a reprint of the Reinforcement stratagem from Astra Militarum, but it's restricted to Endless Multitude units. Well, I don't know if we have necessary confirmation that it does immediately return the destroyed unit to reserve. That is the implication from the posts, at least, that I have seen. On top of that, we also have a return of Bounding Advance. This is the old Hormigaunt rule that allowed them to auto-advance 6 inches and then charge afterwards. Hormigants have advance and charge baked into their datasheet now, at least assuming that that maintains throughout the codex, which I assume that it will. Now, for 1 CP, you can auto-advance a unit 6 inches just for free. And given the fact that a lot of the Endless Multitude units in the Tyranid Codex are very predicated on advancing and doing stuff, either advancing and shooting with termagants or gargoyles and advancing and charging with hormigants, this is a extremely useful stratagem, and it allows you to push the threat range of Hormigants extremely far. Now, the downside of those Hormigants is that they don't typically do a ton of damage once they get into melee. They're just strength 3, AP 1, and a lot of times they're going to be bouncing off people's high toughness or armor. Fortunately, you can supplement that a little bit with another stratagem. We don't know what the name of the stratagem is, but it is 1 CP, grants sustained hits to a unit, so a little bit of the hyper adaptation from the Invasion Fleet detachment. However, there is an additional benefit. If you are 15 or more models in the unit that the stratagem is being used on, you then also get critical hits on a 5+. So you're going to be sustaining on 5s and 6s rather than simply 6s. If you have any other effects to trigger on critical hits, you're also going to trigger those, although I don't know if any of those will be in the codex. Last but certainly not least, the big downside of infantry squads in this edition is the blast ability on weapons. It allows weapons, especially high volume blast weapons, to absolutely ruin large infantry units of 20 or more models. Units like Desolators and even units in the Tyranid mirror match like Zoanthropes are an absolute nightmare for armies like the Unending Swarm, and that is mitigated somewhat by the last stratagem we have today. We don't exactly know what the name is right now, but it allows a unit targeted with blast to count as having 4 models or less. This was very similar to the adaptive ability in 9th edition that Jormungandr had that allowed them to make their units less susceptible to blast. And it is important to remember that this is also repeatable with the Hive Tyrant. So if you've used it on one unit, you could potentially use it on a second. This is incredibly strong in the matchups where your opponent has a lot of blast weapons, especially high volume D3 or D6 shot blast weapons. Units like Alaris Terminators, Desolators, Zoanthropes, even Acolyte hybrids with demolition charges, all of those are extremely good into large infantry squads thanks to blast, and this stratagem really makes a horde list like this function in the way that is intended, where you don't just get absolutely destroyed by random infantry sweepers. While we do have 2 strats that we don't quite know yet, and obviously 3 more enhancements, it sounds on the whole like the Unending Swarm is going to be a primary objective control game. You're going to be forcing OC2 units down your opponent's gullet, using stratagems like Bounding Advance to get gargoyles 24 inches up the table, to get Hormigants 16 inches and then charge with them, and basically just flood your opponent's objectives every turn. While your army is going to die, you can then use that respawn effect to bring your Endless Multitude units back. CP economy is going to be important in this army, especially to fuel the use of that Endless Multitude stratagem. So I imagine that you may even see a Hive Tyrant plus Swarmlord as the late game sort of counterpunch of this list that are sitting behind all of these Termagants and Hormigants that are running up the table. They're going to get stuck in the late game, but in the early game, they're going to make it so you can consistently constantly respawn these endless multitude units. Honestly, this army archetype isn't necessarily my cup of tea, so I don't know if I'm like as excited about it as I am about the Vanguard Onslaught rules, but it does give what looks to be a very effective archetype to Tyranids, where a lot of armies, especially armies that cannot then rely on blast to fight infantry hordes, are going to have a tough time clearing their way through hordes and hordes of Termagants and Hormagaunts, tiny gribbly monsters, and that's super cool. Let me know down in the comment section what you think. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.